Hello and welcome back to the Game Cupboard. My name's Rick and today I'd like to talk to you about Ys Origin on the PlayStation 4. Just a couple of things before we begin. All the footage in this video is taken from the first couple of hours of gameplay to avoid as many spoilers as possible, and also don't forget to like this video and subscribe to the channel for more videos like this. Ys Origin, developed by Nihon Falcom, is technically the 9th game released in the main series, but as the name suggests, is the first in the series chronology. Originally released in Japan in December 2006 for PC, Ys Origin wouldn't see a Western release until it hit Steam in May 2012. It would take an additional 5 years before it would see a release on consoles in spring 2017, complete with a plethora of enhancements and improvements over the original release thanks to the wonderful people at .emu. And that's the version I played, so that's the one I'm going to talk about. Ys Origin is a fast-paced action RPG with a heavy emphasis on frantic combat and quick character progression. When the game begins, there are 2 characters to choose from: Yunika Tova, a headstrong apprentice knight who can't use magic in the classical sense, and Hugo Fact, an accomplished sorcerer and magical prodigy. Both characters play very different to each other, with Yunika using an axe for melee combat, and Hugo using the Eyes of Fact to shoot magic at his enemies from range. The combat system isn't very deep, and most encounters can be won by mindlessly mashing the attack button until everything is dead, especially at the beginning of the game. Some enemies are invulnerable to physical attacks and will need to be dispatched with special skill attacks. These attacks are powerful magic spells related to the elements flame, thunder and wind. They cost MP to use, but MP recovers naturally over time, usually while a spell is still in use, making it possible to chain together skill attacks in a never-ending magical assault if you can get the timing down. Each of the playable characters has 3 Ys artifacts to find, with each artifact unlocking a skill. Each enemy has a skill they are weak against, so encounters with a new enemy type becomes a mosh pit of magic as you frantically cycle through your skills to find the correct attack. Skills can be powered up by collecting jewels that increase MP recovery speed and attack power, and once the first jewel for a particular skill has been collected, the corresponding skill unlocks the ability to be charged for a more powerful and longer lasting attack. Characters have the ability to boost, which can be activated once the boost gauge reaches 100%, temporarily halving the amount of damage taken and increasing the power of skills whilst halving the cost of MP when they're used. Boosting is a lot of fun. It can be the difference between life and death in certain situations, and tearing through enemies at breakneck speed is incredibly satisfying. In fact, satisfying is probably the best word I could use to describe Ys Origin's combat in general. Despite the fact that the closest thing to strategy here is making sure to use the correct skill against the correct enemy, the sheer speed and ferocity of combat makes it a lot of fun. It's definitely more about frantic, fast-paced action than tactical combat, and this is even truer at higher levels. Leveling up in Ys Origin is quick and easy for the most part. Characters receive experience points when defeating enemies, and after a set amount of EXP has been collected, they will level up, increasing their stats considerably. I did find the EXP balance to be a bit off though. When entering a new area, it's possible to jump up several levels in just a few minutes. But every time you level up in an area, the amount of EXP you receive from enemies reduces drastically until you receive so little EXP that staying in the area any longer is a complete waste of time. On the one hand, this is a great way to keep players moving forward through the story at quick pace, but on the other hand, there are times when it is absolutely necessary to grind levels, and this drastic EXP reduction becomes a real hindrance. On several occasions, I'd find myself tearing through the enemies in the area I was in with no issues whatsoever, only to reach a boss and be destroyed in seconds, forcing me to reload and find a place to grind for an hour or so, bringing the previously quick-paced story to a screeching halt. In some areas this wasn't too bad, as there were a couple of nice grinding spots, but in others grinding was a complete pain, especially when the game had decided I was already too strong for the area, so the EXP I was receiving was minuscule. I know it sounds like a small complaint being blown out of proportion, but in Ys Origin as little as 2 extra levels is the difference between struggling against a boss for an hour or destroying it in less than 2 minutes. So I would have appreciated it if the EXP distribution was balanced a little better, so as not to ruin the pace of the game overall. Leveling up isn't the only way to improve your character in Ys Origin. There are several pieces of armour to find throughout the tower that increase your defense stat, and each piece of armour can be upgraded once at Goddess statues for a small amount of SP that is collected from defeated enemies. SP is also used to upgrade other aspects of each character, such as reduced damage taken from terrain, reduced affliction time, increased movement speed, and even an increase to the amount of SP collected. As well as SP and EXP, defeated enemies drop temporary buffs for defense, attack and magic, as well as an XP boost, giving you a nice increase to the EXP you collect while it's active, which can really expedite the leveling grind. There are a bunch of other items to find too, including Rhoda Fruit, which can be given to creatures called Ruse for a number of rewards including weapon upgrades and new armour. Claria Ore can be found hidden around the Devil's Tower and is used to upgrade your weapon for stronger attacks. And Celcetan Panaceas, which raise a character's maximum HP by 3 and are basically useless. There are several essential accessories to find and a whole bunch of inventory items including keys to open new areas and medallions to open boss arenas. At the beginning of the game, you are given a crystal that is used to save your game at goddess statues and allows you to teleport between any statues you've already visited, and a Lila shell to talk to NPCs if you need a hint about where to go next. I found using inventory items to be messy and confusing at times. Some of the items in the inventory must be equipped for their effects to work, but other item effects trigger automatically just by having that item in your inventory. This is never explained in the game, and I think it's pretty stupid. And I'm embarrassed to admit that there was more than one occasion where I died because I just assumed the new inventory item I'd collected was automatically active, because the previous inventory item I collected was automatically active. It would make more sense for these items to be in the equipment menu, and for each character to have an extra equipment slot to accommodate them. But again, this is a small quality of life complaint, and it didn't do anything to lessen my enjoyment of the game overall. Where Ys Origin does fall down for me, however, is in the execution of its story. It takes place 700 years before the events of the other games in the series, so they're trying to fit a lot of backstory into it. After choosing to play as either Unica or Hugo, you get a brief explanation of the history of Ys and the creation of the Devil's Tower the characters find themselves in. Weirdly, this sequence is the only part of the game with a voiceover, and for some reason it's in French. And one sentence flashes up on the screen so quickly it is literally impossible to read. I didn't know what it said until I captured the footage and dropped it into my video editing software for this video. It's a stupid bug, and considering a version of this game has existed for 14 years, it really should have been fixed by now. The story plays out through conversations with NPCs and the occasional visual novel style static image with text overlaid. I didn't mind the lack of cutscenes at all, but I would have liked some actual voiceover in the game. Each playthrough shows the events as they play out for that character, but instead of seeing part of a bigger story from one character's perspective, it plays out how the story would if they were the sole hero of the adventure. Story events and the actions and fates of NPCs differ greatly for each character, meaning each story is full to the brim with contradictions and events that make no narrative sense. And to make things more complicated, once both stories have been finished, a secret third character unlocks, and it's the story of this character that's considered canon within Ys lore. So to get the proper story of Ys Origin, you have to play through it at least 3 times. And each new story seems to overwrite the one that came before it, with the first 2 stories technically never happening anyway. Sure, Hugo and Unica's stories give us backgrounds for all the characters that show up for the 3rd story, but these characters play such a small role in the true story that most of them may as well not be there. And things like item and artifact placement, monster boss fights and environments remain identical for each character, meaning you have to essentially play through the exact same game 3 times. I'm not a fan of when a game boasts multiple stories, only to make you play through the same areas in the same order, fighting the same enemies and bosses, collecting the same items and treasures each time. It feels lazy to me, like a cheap way for the developer to increase a game's length. Personally, I think it would have been better if it was structured in a way that was similar to Kingdom Hearts Birth by Sleep. In that game, even though the 3 characters did share locations, there were enough changes made to the environments to make the playthroughs feel individual. The 3 characters' stories run parallel to each other, which enhanced the overall story instead of outwardly contradicting it, with each playthrough adding missing pieces to the puzzle, and the complete story only coming together once all 3 stories had been finished. There's nothing wrong with the stories themselves, I just think the execution could have been better, and having 3 threads weaving into one coherent story would have made the payoff that much more satisfying. I actually really enjoyed the individual stories, particularly the 3rd character. None of the characters start their journey particularly likeable at first, but with their motivations, history and connections explored through conversations and actions, they changed and grew into characters I genuinely cared about by the end of the game. Each character plays differently too, with Unica and her axe being the closest to a traditional Ys experience, and Hugo's ranged attacks feeling like a clumsy shooter who absolutely would have benefited from revised controls. But again, my favourite of the three is the secret third character. They control the best and have the best story, and I wish I could talk more openly about them, but I can't. But I will say it is totally worth playing through the other two campaigns to get to this one, if you're a fan of Ys lore. Visually, Ys Origins looks pretty nice, with detailed and varied 3D environments and 2D chibi style sprites. Personally, I would have preferred it if the character sprites actually looked like their portraits instead of the deformed style that they are in game, but for what it is, it looks nice. Enemy designs are varied, and I only noticed a couple of palette swaps throughout my adventure. Like the characters, they're 2D sprites, and some of the bigger enemies toward the end of the game have some impressive detail on them. But the most impressive enemies are by far the bosses, huge 3D rendered monstrosities that require their own arena. Each has a pattern and a weakness to figure out, and they can be genuinely challenging if you're not a high enough level. On the flip side to that, if your level is too high, then what should be an impressive spectacle of a fight devolves into 2 minutes of button mashing your way to a cheap victory. I couldn't end this review without talking about Ys Origin's superb soundtrack. Each track is beautifully produced by the Falcom sound team JDK and perfectly reflects the tone of the areas and events playing out on screen. There's a huge variation of styles and atmosphere, with the music often jumping between slow, melancholy string arrangements to high-octane synth organs and electric guitar flawlessly. The standout for me is the track Water Prison. Its slow tribal percussion, uplifting winds and complementary strings really resonated with me while adventuring through this section of the Devil's Tower, and stuck with me long after I left. Despite its flaws, I enjoyed my time with Ys Origin. It isn't the best game I've played in this series, and it certainly isn't my favourite. Each playthrough took me around 10 hours, and having to repeat the same areas and bosses did become a drag toward the end. Luckily, the difference in how each character plays and the differing events of each story was enough to keep me moving forward, and by the end of my third playthrough, I was glad I stuck it out. It's packed full of Easter eggs and references to the rest of the series, so newcomers won't get as much out of it as existing fans. So if you've never played an Ys game before, I wouldn't recommend this as your first, as I don't think it's the best representation of the series. So with all that in mind, I give Ys Origin a solid 7 out of 10. But that's it for my Ys Origin review. Have you played it? What did you think? Let me know in the comments down below or over on Twitter @GameCupboardRick. And finally, thank you very much for watching, and I will see you next time.